October 4th, 1957. A metal ball about the size of a beach ball was launched into orbit around the Earth. It weighed 83 kilograms. It had 4 antennae. It broadcast a simple radio signal. Beep, beep, beep. That beep was picked up by radio operators around the world, including in the United States. And it terrified them. Not because the beeping was dangerous, because it meant the Soviet Union, the communist superpower that the US was locked in a Cold War with, had just demonstrated that they could put objects into space. Objects that flew over American territory. Objects that, theoretically, could be bombs. The United States, the most powerful nation on Earth, the winner of World War II, the country with the first nuclear bomb, had just been beaten into space by the Soviet Union, by a beeping metal ball. The space race had begun, and over the next 12 years, it would produce some of the most extraordinary achievements and some of the most remarkable human stories in the history of civilization. This is the real story of the space race. Buckle up. To understand the space race, you need to understand what was happening on Earth. It is 1957. World War II ended 12 years ago. 2 superpowers now dominate the world. The United States, a democracy with a capitalist economy, nuclear weapons, and enormous military and economic power. The Soviet Union, a communist state also with nuclear weapons, also with enormous military power, and a deep ideological belief that communism was the future of humanity. These 2 countries are not at war, but they are not at peace either. They are in what historians call the Cold War, a competition for global influence, for allies, for technology, for the hearts and minds of countries that had not yet chosen a side. And one of the most powerful tools in that competition was prestige. If the Soviet Union could demonstrate technological superiority, if they could do things America could not, it would suggest to the world that communism was the more capable system. If America could demonstrate superiority, it would suggest the opposite. Space was the most visible possible arena for that demonstration. Whoever controlled space controlled the ultimate high ground. Whoever reached the moon first would have proof, visible to the entire world, of their technological and national greatness. That was the prize. That is why a beeping metal ball was terrifying. Here is something the US government did not want the public to fully appreciate in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Soviet Union was winning, not just Sputnik. Almost everything in the early space race went to the Soviets. First satellite in orbit, Soviet Union. Sputnik 1, October 1957. First living creature in orbit, Soviet Union. A dog named Laika. November 1957. First human in space, Soviet Union. Yuri Gagarin. April 12, 1961. First spacewalk, Soviet Union. Alexei Leonov. March 1965. First woman in space, Soviet Union. Valentina Tereshkova. June 1963. The Soviets had better rockets in the early years. They had a genius rocket engineer named Sergei Korolev, kept secret from the West, who was arguably the most important person in the history of spaceflight. America was behind, and getting more behind. And then President John F. Kennedy made a decision. On May 25, 1961, just 6 weeks after Gagarin orbited the Earth, Kennedy stood before Congress and made an announcement that most of his own advisors thought was impossible. He said, "We are going to the moon before the end of the decade." Let me tell you about Yuri Gagarin, because he deserves his own moment. Gagarin was 27 years old on April 12, 1961, when he climbed into a tiny capsule called Vostok 1 and was launched into orbit around the Earth. He was the first human being to leave Earth's atmosphere, the first human to see the planet from space. The flight lasted 108 minutes. When asked afterward what he saw, Gagarin said, "The Earth is blue. How wonderful. It is amazing." He became the most famous person on Earth almost immediately. Feted in the Soviet Union as a national hero, toured the world, met royalty and heads of state, a symbol of what humans could do. Here's a detail that is easy to miss in the triumph of the moment. The Vostok capsule's landing system was not reliable enough for a safe landing, so Gagarin ejected from the capsule at 7 kilometers altitude and parachuted down separately. He landed in a field in Russia, A farmer's wife and daughter saw him coming down in his orange spacesuit and thought he was an alien. He said, "I am Soviet. I have just come from space. Do not be alarmed," and asked if he could use their telephone. The most famous person on Earth, in a farmer's field, asking to use the phone. I find that extraordinarily human. Kennedy's announcement was remarkable for one specific reason. It was not based on capability. When Kennedy said America would go to the moon before 1970, the U.S. had put exactly one human in space. For 15 minutes. On a suborbital flight that did not even orbit the Earth. The Soviet Union had just put a man in full orbit for 108 minutes. The technology to land on the moon did not yet exist. The rockets were not powerful enough. The navigation systems were not accurate enough. The spacesuits were not reliable enough. Kennedy was not announcing what America could do. He was announcing what America was going to figure out how to do. He was making a public bet, with the whole world watching, that American engineering and American investment could solve problems that had not yet been solved. It worked. NASA's budget went from about $500 million in 1960 to over $5 billion by 1965. At its peak, the Apollo program employed over 400 people. Engineers, scientists, mathematicians, machinists, seamstresses who sewed the spacesuits, 400 people working on a single goal: get to the moon. Before the Soviets, before we get to the moon landing, I need to tell you about the people who died getting there, because both sides lost people. On January 27, 1967, 3 American astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, died when a fire broke out in the Apollo 1 capsule during a ground test, not in space, on the launch pad during a routine test. The cabin atmosphere was 100% pure oxygen. A spark, still not definitively identified, ignited it. The crew could not open the hatch in time. All 3 died within minutes. The Apollo program was halted for nearly 2 years. The Soviet Union had tragedies too. Vladimir Komarov died in 1967 when the parachutes on his Soyuz 1 capsule failed on re-entry. He knew before launch that the capsule had over 200 engineering faults. He flew anyway, because if he refused, his backup, his friend Yuri Gagarin, would have to fly instead. He flew a broken spacecraft to save his friend's life, and died. These men were not statistics. They were engineers and pilots and scientists who understood the risks better than anyone and chose to accept them anyway. Because they believed in what they were doing. The moon was worth it to them, even knowing the cost. July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin land the Apollo 11 lunar module on the surface of the moon. 600 million people, about 1/6 of the entire human population, watch on television. It is the most watched event in television history up to that point. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time, Neil Armstrong steps off the ladder and onto the lunar surface. He says, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Buzz Aldrin follows him. They spend about 2.5 hours on the surface. They plant an American flag, they collect rock samples, they take photographs, and then they leave. They return to the orbiting command module, piloted by Michael Collins, the astronaut who did not walk on the moon, who orbited alone above while his crewmates made history, and who later said he felt completely at peace up there. The 3 astronauts returned to Earth. They splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969, 5 months before Kennedy's end-of-decade deadline. From Kennedy's announcement to the moon landing, 8 years. From Sputnik, 12 years. From zero human space experience to footprints on the moon. 12 years. It is still one of the most extraordinary things our species has ever done. Here is something most people do not know. The Soviet Union never landed on the moon. They had a moon program. They built a rocket, the N-1, that was designed to take cosmonauts to the moon. The N-1 was enormous, bigger than Saturn V, the American moon rocket, and it exploded 4 times in test launches between 1969 and 1972. One of the N-1 explosions in 1969, just a few weeks before Apollo 11, was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. It destroyed the entire launch pad. The Soviet moon program was plagued by problems. disagreements between rival design bureaus, the death of Sergei Korolev, their genius rocket engineer, in 1966, insufficient funding, political pressure. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon, the Soviet Union officially denied that they had ever been trying to go to the moon. They claimed the moon landing had never been their goal. The secret moon program was only officially acknowledged after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. For 25 years, the Soviets pretended they had never been trying. They had been trying. They had spent enormous resources trying, and they had lost. Here is the part that often gets overlooked in the triumph of the moon landing. The space race gave us things we still use every day. Memory foam, invented for NASA crash protection, now in mattresses worldwide. Scratch-resistant lenses, developed from NASA research into helmet visors. CAT scans and MRI technology, derived from digital image processing developed for lunar photography. Water filtration technology, developed for astronaut water recycling. Cordless tools. Black & Decker developed cordless drills specifically for NASA moon rock collection. GPS technology, derived from satellite navigation research developed during the space race. The miniaturization of electronics. The Apollo computers needed to be as small as possible. The pressure to make electronics smaller faster was enormously accelerated by the space program. The modern semiconductor industry owes significant debts to NASA's demand for the smallest possible computers in the 1960s. Every time you use your smartphone, which contains more computing power than the entire Apollo program, you are using technology whose development was shaped by the space race. Two nations competing to prove which system was better ended up inadvertently improving life for everyone on Earth. Competition at its best does that. Here is what the space race taught me. Humans do extraordinary things when the stakes are high enough and the goal is clear enough. 400,000 people. 8 years. A goal that did not yet have the technology to achieve it. And they figured it out. Not because they were superhuman. Because the goal was clear, the deadline was real, and the resources were there. Kennedy did not say, "We will try to go to the moon." He said, "We will go to the moon. Before the end of the decade. Full stop." And that specificity, that commitment, changed what was possible. There is a version of this story where it is about competition and Cold War geopolitics, and that version is true. But there is another version where it is about what happens when a civilization decides to do something impossible and refuses to stop until it is done. Neil Armstrong's footprint is still on the moon. There is no wind on the moon, no rain, no erosion. That footprint from July 20th, 1969 is still there, preserved in the gray lunar dust, exactly as he left it. It will still be there in 1,000 years, in 1,000,000 years. Long after every other trace of us has gone, a human footprint on the moon. If stories like this, the real stories of what humans are capable of, are your thing, you already know what to do.